It's been reported that the government are cracking down on activist civil servants who waste taxpayer money on diversity. Cabinet Office Minister Glen has ordered a review of Whitehall diversity networks and a refresh of civil service impartiality guidance to stop officials using their job as a vehicle for political activism. His words, not mine. Under plans discussed with Kemi Badenoch and Esther McVeigh, diversity meetings would have to be held before work, during lunch breaks or in the evening. Their own time, basically. Now, joining me now is political commentator Peter Spencer to explain what's going on here. Peter, good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining me on this lovely Sunday afternoon. Yeah. Peter, what do you make of what has been said here?
Well, it is obviously the case that there's a certain amount of wokery has crept into the civil service sort of mindset, and I dare say with cutting back on some of the activities that take place during work hours, there might be marginal reductions. But I do have to say that in the scheme of things, I had this down as very much a detail. I mean, look, this fits into the broader narrative from Rishi Sunak and the Chancellor, which is we're going to give you some lovely spangly tax cuts, so please vote Conservative. And of course, anything that, and they always bang on about how we're going to efficiency savings, and they very rarely come to anything. That said, there is another aspect of this stuff from the cabinet secretary John Glen, which matters a great deal more, which is that he's talking about downsizing the civil service by no less than 66,000. That is going to get the civil service unions absolutely spitting nails, and there's already a spat going on with them over the Rwanda crossings and the fear expressed by the civil service unions that that they will be called upon to break international law and allow flights to take off in defiance of injunctions from the court, the International Court of Human Rights. Now, the answer to that, according to John Glen, is to say, well, if anybody doesn't like it, they can jolly well do one. But if the civil servants gather round in sympathy and protest alongside anybody who might get the sack, then the government has got yet another huge fight on its hands.
Peter, I'm slightly confused here because basically they're not the elected people running the country. They are civil servants. So we pay their wages. So surely they should just be doing their jobs? Bit old-fashioned?
Well, no. You're absolutely right. They should just be doing their jobs, of course. And although there are very severe questions to be raised over staff at the Home Office doing their jobs when we consider the fact that we have this huge and ridiculously expensive backlog of asylum claims, which, as you rightly say, the taxpayers are footing the bill for their hotels and things. These claims could be sorted out in a matter of weeks, and a lot of them taking well over a year. So my advice to them would be to try a jolly sight harder.
And do you think, I mean, the civil service have been nicknamed the blob by various politicians now, have they? I mean, do you think that's a fair description of how powerful they seem to be?
Well, I expect you, Dawn, will remember those glorious yes minister and yes prime minister things, and how Sir Humphrey would always run rings around the minister stroke prime minister. But in the end, there is a constant, I mean, because one of the factors in this, now I come to think about it, is the fact there's been quite a lot of churn of ministers. And the rule of thumb is it takes a year or two for any new minister to seriously get his or her head round the brief with which they're presented. And so in the interim, who's going to actually sort of work things out and make stuff happen? Well, it's Sir Humphrey, not the minister.
They're probably more intelligent, some ministers as well. And finally, Peter, how much of a vote winner do you think this is, what John has said today, John Glen has said?
I don't think it'll make a lot of difference, to be honest. I mean, we note that the story has been picked up by the Sunday Telegraph, also occasionally known to some as the Tory graph. They're on manoeuvres the same as the government is because the election's coming up. But we haven't read a great deal about this anywhere else. And as I say, the big story is going to be cut to the panning levels rather than this fairly marginal detail.
OK. Peter Spencer, thank you very much for joining us there. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday. Thank you. OK, interesting story, this, isn't it? So let's see what my marvellous panel make of it. I'm joined by political commentator Jo Phillips and Telegraph columnist Madeline Grant. Thank you very much for joining. And I was joking before we went on air that last week I had two chaps with me. So the girls haven't got to try too hard to beat that bar, have they? Does that make
We've turned up.
Exactly.
We can go now, can't we?
Yeah, Miss Andrew Central, before anyone complains, we're joking, OK? Now, this was a story, it's on the front page of at least one of the papers today, isn't it? I'm going to come to you first on this one, actually, Jo. What do you make of what our John Glen, who most people have not heard of,
No, and they probably won't either,
has said today?
Well, I think this is... it's been picked up, as Peter said, and, Madeline's paper, The Telegraph. It's one of those things that the government seems, in the absence of anything else, find something to attack. Let's attack the people who can't speak out for themselves. Now, if we take this apart slightly, Dawn, and we look at diversity training, which I know a lot of viewers and listeners will go, what a load of nonsense. Let's put it in the context of the Metropolitan Police, found to be horrifically, dangerously racist, sexist, homophobic and everything else. You know, we saw the way the Met turned a blind eye to people who are now in prison for rape and murder and sexual assault and other things. If you want your institutions to get better and not say, oh, it's just a bit of banter, it's just a bit of fun, where's your sense of humour, then you actually have to do something that brings people together, and that has got the unfortunate name of diversity training, which sounds frightfully worthy. But we've got John Glen wanting to save money, apparently. I don't think diversity training in the civil service actually costs a lot of money compared to the fact that we saw today or yesterday a report out that not one single company has been prosecuted for tax avoidance and dodgy behaviour, despite a new law being brought in 2017. Look at the money that has been wasted on PPE and corruption and fraud.
There is that, absolutely. Madeline, this is in your paper, The Telegraph, and it is, on the surface, a good story, but does Jo have a point here? It's a bit like, look over there, don't look at the stuff that's really important.
Well, I think what it actually can be quite counterproductive for the government in the sense that it reminds people of a small C Conservative persuasion that they have been in charge for a very long time, and this stuff has been allowed to often run rampage. I think going beyond the what Jo is talking about, sensible, non-divisive discussions, etc. Some of what goes on in diversity training is, I think, incredibly divisive. It involves concepts like unconscious bias, the idea that you're sort of racist without even being aware of it.
Yeah.
And people are forced to go through it. And very contested ideas like this that I think are the opposite of what's likely to bring people together. I mean, I think there's a country like America, for example, where this stuff has gone even further. I don't think America is actually in a better place since it embraced this particular model of how to encourage diversity or indeed to kind of bring people together. So I think sometimes they're going far beyond what ordinary people would be comfortable with. And of course, it's happening in all sorts of workplaces in the private sector as well. But as you said, we do pay for this. So I think we have a right to know what goes on and to hope that what's being talked about is not going into the realm of hyper-partisan divisiveness.
Jo, I completely understand your point about the Met Police. I mean, but it is a different kettle of fish. I mean, the civil service is already very diverse. I mean, 54.5% of civil servants are women, and I think it's 6.1% identify themselves as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or other, whereas only 1.5% of the population do. So they're already quite diverse, and we are paying civil servants to do their job, not sit around having meetings.
But this isn't about how they interact necessarily with each other. It's how they interact with us, the people they are serving. So whether that is a passport officer, somebody at the DVLA, somebody on the border force, somebody in any number of government departments, it could be that any one of us will deal with at some point. Diversity isn't just about the colour of your skin or your sexuality. It's actually about, age, physical and mental impairment.
Somebody pointed out disability earlier on, which often gets overlooked.
Yes, well, exactly, and I think that's a really good point because it's ever so easy to go, oh, it's woke nonsense, it's ridiculous.
You do it very well.
Why doesn't everybody pull themselves together and just be sensible? From a government that, as Madeline says, they've been there for 13 years. This has been going on for such a long time, and we've had a previous Home Secretary who referred to the civil service as a blob. This is a woman who also used the most appalling language about immigrants and was pictured memorably standing on the tail of a guide dog, which I think tells you everything you need to know about the previous Home Secretary. But, disability gets ignored, ageism gets ignored.
Yes, true.
Little things like visual and hearing impairments. That's about how do you deal with people, and how do you, if you're on the call centre line, for instance, in a civil service department, how do you recognise that somebody needs help?
The problem with this argument, I completely understand that, but the problem with this particular argument, Madeline, is that 48% of civil servants are still working either completely or partly from home.
Yeah.
So that isn't really echoing what many of us are doing out here.
Well, actually, some of the examples that Jo gave just then, I think in terms of ordinary people's interactions with the civil service, the big takeaway is that things don't function on a basic level and they would like them to. And actually, therefore, all hands ought to be on deck for making sure that services are running, as opposed to wasting time, essentially, sitting in these workshops. Rather than actually cracking on and getting on with the business of running a country. The DVLA didn't work for a considerable length of time.
And
they're still massively backed up.
Yeah, if you try phoning...
It's sort of like fiddling while Rome burns, really, in that context.
Yeah.
But part of that is, as Peter Spencer referred to, is the churn of ministers. If you've got a new minister, we've had 16 housing ministers.
It's quite difficult to keep up, to be fair.
So you're a civil servant, fairly low down the food chain. You've got another minister who comes in with yet another initiative.
Yeah.
I'd love to know how much the government has spent on reprinting photographs, labels, stationery and all of that stuff to keep up with the churn of ministers. And that's not, they're just the ones that we see, many of whom will have just slipped back into the obscurity that they richly deserve. But, further down the chain, and as Peter said, without the civil service, nothing would function, because we'd be relying on somebody to come up with a brilliant idea only to be moved to a different department by the afternoon.
This is true. I'm not entirely sure things are functioning that well as it is at the
No,
moment.
they're not.
But,
They're dreadful. They're absolutely dreadful. But we'll come on to that in a minute.
I can't wait for that. That's so exciting, isn't it? Any case, right, for all the best analysis and opinion on that, just as good as these two, not even better. For the story and more, you can go to our website, gbnews.com.